After you have taught the student the direct contact reached through meditation, is there not something debilitating in continuing the relationship of teacher-student? No, that would be impossible, unless you can imagine it being debilitating to remain with Christ Jesus, or Buddha, or Lao Tzu, or any other teacher. Heaven forbid. Think now, a spiritual teacher, I'm emphasizing that, spiritual teacher has no ties to his student. He has absolutely no human ties. The student is under no obligation to the teacher. Teacher is under no obligation to the student. The teacher's only obligation is to live up to his or her own spiritual integrity. They owe no man anything but to love them. And the only way they can love them is by maintaining their own spiritual integrity and not violating it. And so a teacher owes nothing to anyone but himself or herself. And what he owes is the maintaining of his own conscious oneness with God. Now, a student owes nothing to a teacher. A student owes it to himself or herself to live up to the highest sense of right of which they have understanding, to live up to their highest sense of spiritual integrity. And that's all they owe to anyone, just to themselves. So that the bond between a spiritual teacher and a spiritual student is a bond of divine love, not human love. It is a bond of spiritual love, not sensual love. The teacher does not owe any monetary support to the student. The student does not owe any monetary support to the teacher. On the other hand, the teacher, if the teacher finds there is a financial need in some direction with a student, may help that student. Or if the student wishes to express gratitude, free will gratitude, they may do so, whether it's for the teacher's use or for some other use of the ministry. But obligation there is none in either direction. Now, if I maintain my spiritual integrity, I will answer every legitimate call from a student. If the student maintains their spiritual integrity, they will call on me only for their spiritual welfare. That may, in a work like ours, include spiritual healing of mind or body or purse. That's absolutely legitimate because it's all a part of our spiritual unfoldment. But a student would never burden me with their personal cares, worries, or woes, except in the nature of presenting them for the purpose of having help. And certainly I would not burden a student with any problems if I should have any. So you see that there is no relationship between a student and a teacher, a spiritual teacher, that could weary or weaken or debilitate. There is no relationship of dependence. The relationship is one of assistance, but in no case dependence. I know that in the experience of our work, I have never known a student to cling to me in any unnatural way, depend on me, or feel that I was necessary to keep them going. I've never had that experience. Probably the reason is I set every student free. Every student is free. They are my student only as long as they name themselves my student. I very seldom refer to anyone as my student because I don't really feel that anyone is my student beyond the time they want to be. And they may want to change their mind tomorrow and wander off, and if they do, they're welcome to it. I hold no one, and no spiritual teacher would ever hold anyone. Even in the metaphysical practice as I knew it formerly, never did I refer to anyone as my patient. A patient perhaps, but not my patient. Nor did I look on anyone who came to me as a permanent patient. They came to me today for help, and I gave it. But they're free tomorrow to go anywhere they wish, and without reporting to me if they so desire. I have never had a tie of any nature on a patient or on a student. I have never taken any student into membership. None. And regardless of how high the student goes with me, and we have some that are right on top of the inner circle, they still are under no obligation to remain, certainly under no obligation to support me. My conscious contact with God has done that abundantly. And so it is that we are free. I am free to travel the world and not feel that I have to stay in any one place for any person or group of persons. They are free to travel the world without consideration for me. Now, in a relationship of that kind, a great love develops between us, a real love and friendship like many of you have witnessed right here in this hotel during this week. Many of you have seen whole groups of us together, dozens of us, and some of us are together in cities all around this globe at different times, and you'll see how friendly we are. But the very moment that the evening is over, we each go our own way. The moment the class is over, we each go our own way, and the only bond between us is a spiritual one. It's a beautiful one. From my experience with spiritual teachers in other parts of the world, more especially those that I would include in the title of spiritual teacher, they understand the same thing, that the bond is a spiritual one, that each one is free. Now, there is a great deal of talk about loyalty to a teacher. Loyalty to a teacher means only that love and respect for the one that is imparting to the student the secrets of life. Now, you couldn't possibly receive the pearl of great price without having respect, honor, gratitude, love for the one that shared with you the secret of life that you could find no other way. You can't find the secret of life in a book. You can't find the secret of life in holy mountains or temples. The secret of life has to come to you from an individual to whom it has been entrusted. Those on the spiritual path come up through their years of study, discipleship, living in the Spirit, until a certain day when they are entrusted with the Word, the message, the principle, and given the message, the ordination of teaching. You will remember the master in the platform of the Hebrew synagogue saying, "I am ordained." The Spirit of God is upon me. I am ordained. So it comes into the experience, and this is what constitutes a spiritual teacher. A spiritual teacher may be a student of truth, a student of metaphysics, a student of the Orient, a student of any kind of spiritual teaching, but eventually there comes a day of ordination when something takes place within the consciousness of that individual, that student, and he is changed. He is entrusted with a mission or a message. And as happened in my case, I was given a 2-month period of inner initiation, at the end of which time I was caused to kneel and take a vow. And then I was ordained on the inner plane and told I must never seek a student, that I must accept those who are sent to me as students and then to share with them. And this has been my program for 16 years or more, not advertising for people to come, not promising anybody any rewards, but waiting until an individual is led to me because something within them says, this is my teacher or this is my teaching, and then I go all out to share with them. Now, all do not remain, all are not loyal, all are not true. There are many Lot's wife who go a certain distance from the old city and then turn around and look back and decide the bridge game is a little bit more important than this afternoon session. There are many who, with some measure of enlightenment, find their ego inflated. They seem to become important under it instead of humble. They drift away. All who come do not remain, but all who come, as long as they come, receive that which is given to me to give them. Just in the same way that we are met in this week. You have already observed that I withhold nothing, that whatever is put into my mouth is spoken, that it isn't made up, it isn't rehearsed, it is the Word of God as it is revealed. Not revealed a year ago, revealed now as I sit here with you. All right, I am your teacher, you are my students. But you know also that once you leave this hall, there is no communication from me unless it first come from you. But if it come from you, you know how promptly my answer comes to you. In other words, the relationship between us is voluntary. The relationship between us is spiritual. The relationship between us is such that I respect you so deeply that I would never lie to you knowingly or withhold from you, and that's all I expect of you. There is no other obligation between us except to love one another. That can't ever be debilitating. It can't ever be weakening. It can't ever make of you a leaner, because no spiritual teacher permits that. Just as the Master says, if I go not away, the Comforter will not come to you. So my help to you only carries you so far. And you are never permitted to feel that you can just do nothing and let me do it. I just am not that kind of teacher. I am more like the birds that push their little ones out of the nest and say, fly out of here or fall. Stand or fall on your own inner integrity. And to me that represents teaching the way it is given to me on the inner plane to teach. Everything that takes place in the infinite way is an instruction given to me within. None of it has ever represented my will. None of it has ever represented my desire. All of it represents the way I am shown. And it is for this reason that without organization, without advertising, without proselyting, without promotion, this teaching has gone around the world and interested not only people, but churches, ministers, rabbis, priests. Because it is free. It demands nothing. It doesn't demand that every word you say, you have to say, Joel said this. It doesn't demand that you tell everybody how much you love Joel. It doesn't demand anything of you except your own personal integrity. That's all. And I believe that any spiritual teacher that is under the guidance of the Spirit would tell you the same. If at any time students become overly dependent on a teacher, it may be that the teacher hasn't noticed it, and then if they become weak through that leaning and dependence, they have themselves to blame. Because each one is an individual. In free countries, everyone is a thinker. Everyone has the schooling that enables them to be a thinker. Everyone has the capacity to think for themselves, and they do not have to be misled. In forgiving 70 times 7, the practice of instant dismissal is the practice of instant dismissal of human error and turning inward, the 70 times 7. Every single day we look out at this world and we are aware of what seems to be evil people and evil conditions. And actually, every time we retranslate this, it is an act of forgiveness. And so it is that in the course of a day we're called on 100 times, 200 times to forgive. That is, to exchange the scene as we see it for the reality that we know is there. And this is indeed forgiving 70 times 7. The only thing is, if you were to count up the 490, you'd find that we use up that 490 every week of the year. Do you consider the United Nations Association an agency for or against the realization of oneness in the world? May I say that the United Nations can be an agency for bringing oneness and peace to the world, not in and of itself. The United Nations is just a dead piece of paper in a dead building. But the consciousness of those who act as the United Nations could certainly set this world free, without any question of doubt. Freedom will never come from an organization. It will never come from a scrap of paper. It will never come from an edifice. Freedom will only come from the goodwill of God expressed as man and through man. Therefore, if we ever have a United Nations peopled with people who submit themselves to God, it will unify the world and bring peace on earth. And if we do not accomplish that, the United Nations can do no more for us than a police department. A police department, no matter how big it is, cannot maintain the safety and security of a city. The only thing that can is if there is a police department empowered or permeated with civic consciousness. If there are such men at the head of a police department and in the body of a police department, the city will be well policed. It will be safe and secure. The police department can't do it. There are loads of cities with police departments just as corrupt as you can imagine. It is the integrity of those who form the police department. So it is. You have witnessed the United Nations in disgrace. You have witnessed it violate every single concept of decency, of Christianity, of freedom. You have witnessed the United Nations where it should have a mourning flag at its mast. There's nothing wrong with the United Nations. It's the people that form the United Nations at that particular moment. And as long as there are people there willing to stand for somebody to slap shoes on a table and swear, and use vile language and make foul accusations, the United Nations cannot serve to unify the world. When it is peopled by people who say, you can't do that, and are willing to call the guards and say, remove that character and lock him up until he learns decency, integrity, until we have a body of men there, don't believe that it will unify. There is nothing in the League of Nations of a unifying nature except the nature and integrity of the men who form it. And if they haven't got that, there's no United Nations to act. Personally, I do believe the United Nations should be continued. To begin with, aside from unifying the world in this political sense, it is creating goodwill for the free countries of the world by its conduct toward the have-nots and the illiterates. It's doing a tremendous work, and it should be continued. And as long as it's continued, there is the hope that in the political department there will be men and women willing to stand up, as some few have, and absolutely demand international integrity. Then the United Nations can serve as a unifying nation, a unifying force, and one for world peace. Sometimes, because we don't organize as a church, I'm asked the question, are you against churches? And I must say to you that above all things, I am not against churches. Again, I am asked, do you believe there should be only one church? And again, I say, no, I don't. I'm just as satisfied to have 10,000 churches and 10,000 different denominations and sects. What do you hope? I hope that every one of these churches will agree that there's only one God. When they do that, we can multiply the amount of churches as many times as you want without harm. As long as the churches will agree that by going into the Hebrew synagogue, the Protestant church, the Catholic church, the Vedantist church, the Zen church, that you will still be worshiping the same God, we can have as many churches as we want. And frankly, the more we have, the more enjoyable it is, as world travelers have found who have visited the Catholic cathedrals abroad and the Zen temples and the Buddhist temples in Japan and some of the temples in China, in Thailand, Burma. I'm to have a very interesting trip in October, giving talks in the African churches in Nigeria, where they have been, the Christian churches, where they've been studying the infinite way for the past 5 years. And they are preparing this little tour by automobile. Be assured I will love every single minute of it, as I have enjoyed my trips to Oriental churches, Occidental churches, Catholic cathedrals, Hebrew synagogues, in every part of the world, mosques in the Muslim country. To me, there is only one God, and therefore it makes no difference what church, synagogue, or temple I'm in. It's the same God to which I bend my knee. Now, can you tell me what harm there is in my being in any and every one of those to do my bending to the one God that is closer to me than breathing? So it is, I know, from the experience with students everywhere, that the moment they are touched by the Christ, there is no longer bias, bigotry, or any alien feeling of that kind within them toward races, religions, colors, or creeds. I know that for the human being brought up with prejudice, bias, and bigotry, it's a very difficult thing to get rid of it. In the same way that it is very difficult for some good people to come to an understanding of forgiving the sinner. Very difficult. We had an experience recently where capital punishment was the subject. And these people, who are very, very good Christians to their sense of it, just couldn't see why we didn't immediately sentence them all to death. All of these criminals, all of these murderers, right away, and save ourselves $1.50 a day for supporting them. Now, you can see what was operating. They're very good people, and therefore they're very intolerant of anyone who isn't quite that good according to their standard of goodness. And so it is that you can't set aside that habit of self-righteousness and pulling your skirts aside when the other kind of neighbor walks down the street. No one who has ever been touched by the Spirit of God, whether it was Jew or Gentile, whether it was Oriental or Occidental, no one who has ever been touched by the Spirit has ever been able to know or experience bias, bigotry, jealousy, envy, hate, or any of those qualities. Now, the reason is we call it being touched by the Christ. The Hebrew might think of it in some other term, the Spirit of God. Definitely the Japanese says Satori, and the Hindu says Darshan. But you see, every one of these words means being touched by the Spirit. And there is only one Spirit. There are no Gentile spirits and Jewish spirits. There are no Occidental spirits and Oriental spirits. There is only one Spirit. So if it touches the Jew or the Gentile, the Occidental, the Oriental, the Muslim, the Vedantist, It's the same Spirit that has touched them, and it has the same effect on them. It sets them free. And here you have, out of the Hebrew Scriptures, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. And it's not a Hebrew Lord, and it's not a Christian Lord. It's just the Lord. Well, someday we are going to have a body of men in this world touched by the Spirit. And they will meet, and peace will be. Definitely there will be peace, and definitely peace will come through the activity of the Spirit that is now abroad in the world. It is touching the people of all lands. It is noticeable in some places, not quite so noticeable in others. It is noticeable in one way in some places, noticeable in other ways in other places. Those who have been touched by the Spirit are helping and can further help to awaken mankind to this touch of the Spirit by their prayers, by their own act of fulfilling the acts of grace, forgiveness, praying for the enemy. But above all, by an understanding of the nature of the Messiah. The Hebrews made a terrible mistake, not in expecting the Messiah, but in believing that the Messiah was going to be a temporal power like a king, or the general of an army, or perhaps a combination king and general, and that he would not only destroy the power of Rome and the Holy Lands, but that he would also bring about reforms inside the synagogue, the temple. That blunder cost them their life's demonstration, because the Messiah is nothing like that. The Messiah speaks and says, "My kingdom is not of this world. Put up thy sword. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword." They couldn't understand that. They couldn't grasp it. Their dream for centuries had been for a combination king, emperor, general, and they didn't have it. Now, in the religious history of the world, most people think of God in that light. Most people think of God as an almighty king. They even sing hymns to the almighty king. The king that goes out before us to slay our enemies. The king that conquers lands for us. The result has been that when conquerors have gone out with armies, there's always been some kind of a minister or a priest to bless them, as if God sanctioned conquering of other people, or that God could bless such a thing. Armies and navies go out to slay, and somebody can always be found to say a prayer for them. All of this is based on the erroneous teaching of the Hebrews, that God is, the ancient Hebrews, not the moderns, that God is an almighty king, and his function is to see that our enemies are slain and that we are victorious. Always that word victorious comes into the hymns. Victorious. We must always be victorious, which would be true if only we could be victorious as the Master taught. I have overcome the world. Not the world of Caesar, not the world outside. I have overcome the world in me. I have overcome greed, lust, mad ambition. I have overcome sensuality, false desires, false appetites. I have overcome this world in me. Even while he was saying, I have overcome the world, Caesar was going on, and the most horrible years of the Hebrew temple were going on. Probably the Hebrew temple was at its lowest ebb of morality, integrity, from 100 BC to 200 AD. That was its really poorest years of history. And all of this continuing right while the Master could say, I have overcome the world. Spiritually, when you have overcome the world, Mr. K may still be sitting on his throne. And somebody will look at you and say, you may think so, but that bomb is still out there. It will nevertheless be true that you have overcome the world because you have no fear of the bomb or Mr. K. You have no fear of sin or disease. You have no fear of temptation. You have no fear of lack or limitation. You have overcome the world. Why? Because you have been touched by the Messiah. The Messiah has been raised up in you. The Son of God has been lifted up. And now, after you have been touched, you can say, I live, yet not I. The Christ liveth my life. I can do all things through Christ, the Christ that dwelleth in me, the Savior, the Messiah, the Spirit of God, the Son of God, that dwelleth in me. When this has been raised up in you, there's no need to take thought for your life, what you shall eat or what you shall drink, or wherewithal you shall be clothed. Because this Son of God raised up in you goes before you to perform every function of your existence. Our purpose as spiritual teachers is to help those who desire that the Son of God be raised in them, to assist them to it, never to make them worship us or depend on us, but to come to us that we may help them lift up that Son of God in them and set them free, so that they too may be able to say, I have overcome the world. I and my Father are one. But this will not come if you do not change your concept of God and the Christ and eliminate from your consciousness any belief that God or Christ is a temporal power. God is spirit and must be worshipped in spirit and in truth. God is spirit, and God governs through love, not by destroying anything, but by revealing the non-existence of anything other than the presence of God. Therefore, when you pray, don't pray that God do anything. Just pray that the Son of God be lifted up in me. Just pray that the Messiah govern my experience. Don't ask the Messiah to defeat your enemies or your competitors. Just pray that the Messiah be raised up in you as a spirit of love and it will be so unto you. And the more you dwell in the realization of God and the Christ as Spirit, the greater will be your own demonstration of the Christ in your experience. The danger always is in going back to the ancient beliefs that make us believe that God is some kind of a power. Christ is some kind of a power. And once we get hold of it, we'll be able to out-Houdini Houdini. We won't. Be assured we won't. We won't overcome any enemies. We won't overcome any competitors. We'll just live and move and have our being in a joyous peace, abundance, friendliness, and we live by grace rather than by might or by power. That statement alone ought to show us that the nature of God and the Christ isn't a power, not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit, saith the Lord. All things are accomplished by the Spirit, not by might, not by power. And it's a gentle spirit, and you can tell this from God is not in the whirlwind. God is not in sin, disease, false appetite. God is not in poverty. God is in the still, small voice. And to bring yourself to a life under God means merely to bring yourself to a life whereby you can be so innerly still that when the still, small voice talks to you, it seems as if it were thundering. It can be a subject for your contemplative meditation. Take into meditation that question. What is the Christ? What is the nature of the Christ? What is the function of the Christ? Always remembering this, the Christ isn't something outside of you that has to be sought. The Christ is something that is already within you, waiting to catch the attention of your ear. So you're addressing yourself down here, almost it would seem that you're directing yourself into your chest. What is the Christ? What is the Spirit of God in man? What is the function of Christ in my life? What is the nature of the presence that goes before me to make the crooked places straight? What is the nature of the power that appeared to Moses as a cloud and a pillar of fire and manna falling from the sky? What is the nature of the Father within me that healed the sick for the Master? What is the nature of this Christ that is within me that enables me to forgive sinners? All power is given to me on earth. The Christ within me has the power to forgive sinners, to heal the sick, to raise the dead, to feed all who require it. What is the nature of this Christ that is the bread and the meat and the wine and the water unto me and unto the woman at the well, and anyone else who wishes to come to me? And meditating along that line, you may be assured of this: the answer will come forth from within your own being, because you must open out a way. This Christ, this Messiah, is within you. The Messiah isn't a man who is going to come, nor is the Messiah a man who is going to come a second time. The Messiah is the Son of God that was planted in you in the beginning before Abraham was. I was with you before Abraham was. This Christ, this Messiah, is the Spirit of God that is planted in man in the beginning. Not in the beginning of our parenthesis on earth. No. In the beginning, when we were one with God. In the beginning, when we were formed as the image and likeness of God. In the beginning, God planted His Son in the midst of us. His Christ, His Messiah, and its function is to live our lives. Its function is to raise us up. Its function is to redeem us. Its function is to prepare paths for us. Its function is to prepare mansions for us. It was given to us in the beginning. It's now locked up. And we must open out a way that it can flow into our experience, and we do this by acknowledgement. Lean not unto thine own understanding. Acknowledge me. Acknowledge me in the midst of you. Acknowledge the Christ in the midst of you. I can do all things through Christ that dwelleth in me. This is the acknowledgement that there is a Christ dwelling in me. It is true, Saul of Tarsus never knew it. Only in that blinding flash when he became Paul did he become aware of the Christ indwelling. As long as we are the natural man who receiveth not the things of God, we will not know that we have an indwelling Spirit of God, Son of God, or Christ Messiah. But in that moment, when the Spirit of God is upon us and we are ordained, in that moment we become aware it is true. It is true. I have an indwelling something. Presence, glory. It's not here just to glorify me. Its function is to glorify God, to prove what life is when it's governed by God, to prove what life is when it's maintained and sustained by God. Then we become witnesses to God's grace. We become witnesses to the presence of the Christ within us. Only be careful. Don't make of the Christ some kind of a temporal power to do temporal things. Be satisfied that Christ is a spirit in you. Be satisfied you can do all things through that Christ, with love, with wisdom, with judgment, with equity, with mercy, with equality, with peace. The realization of this, and this alone, brings about the peace that passeth understanding. There is no way to get peace from this world. You may attain fame and have more troubles than you bargained for. You may attain wealth and have more troubles than you bargained for. But the Master points out the difference in that tremendous passage, my peace give I unto thee. Not as the world giveth. What is the nature of my peace? You don't know humanly, and no one can tell you. My peace is a state of peace that descends upon us, not because of some good thing that happened in the outer world, but because of some wonderful thing that took place within us. You may call it an assurance. An assurance. I am with you. I will never leave thee. I will be with thee to the end of the world. And you can almost sing your way through life. with that refrain that goes on in there once you have become aware Christ dwelleth in me. The Messiah is within me. And no need now to worry. No need now to fear. There is an invisible presence making my pathway straight. Thank you.